747 flying towards South Africa fills with smoke. A fire has erupted in the cargo area, but the plane can't land. It's too far over the Indian Ocean.
The first thought, I think, for many, many South Africans was what was on that plane.
The passengers are choking on toxic fumes.
Request a full emergency, please.
Affirmative, that's Charlie.
There's only one way to clear the smoke. The crew must try a rarely used and risky maneuver.
Open the doors.
Open the doors in flight.
Springbok 295, places.
It's a race against time as the plane burns up. It must reach land before it crashes into the sea.
Springbok 295, places. Mayday.
On November the 27th, 1987, a South African Airways 747 flies from Taiwan back home to South Africa.
Everything good?
Fine, Captain. Ready to take over?
Yes, thanks.
9 hours into their flight over the Indian Ocean, the main crew returns to their seats, allowing the relief crew to rest. The crew prepares for a scheduled stop on the island of Mauritius. Valerie Lottering has enjoyed her first overseas vacation, joining her husband Corrie while he was on business.
My father was on a business trip, and my mum had gone with for holidays. My dad had actually gone to the east to secure cell phone technology, which was just sort of happening in South Africa at the time.
The plane is a modified 747 known as a combi, short for combination. A passenger plane and a cargo plane in one, it's designed to accommodate flexible quantities of passengers and cargo. The combi has a large cargo area down below, like a regular 747. The combi also has a large cargo area right behind the last row of economy class seats. The cockpit sits one level above the cabin.
You could load from 6 to 12 pallets on the main deck, adjusting the bulkhead for the number of passengers you wanted to carry. And this turned out to be a very worthwhile and useful tool.
Flight 295 is carrying 159 people, as well as 6 large pallets of cargo. Known as the Helderberg, the 747 Combi is a vital member of the South African Airways fleet. It's particularly useful for long-range flying.
For South African Airways, during the days of apartheid, a plane like the Combi helped them in that respect, because they had to fly around the bulge of Africa over the Atlantic.
To protest South Africa's white racist regime, the vast majority of black African states refused to allow South African airlines to fly over their airspace, causing them to fly longer routes.
There were sanctions, heavy sanctions against South Africa on political, economic, and cultural fronts. South Africa was not welcome anywhere credible in the world.
On Flight 295, less than an hour before its stop in Mauritius, the smoke alarm breaks the calm of the cockpit. It's for the cargo area on the main deck, directly behind the passengers. By the time the crew gets to it, the fire is raging.
It's bad.
Shall I get another bottle over there?
Yeah, hurry.
Read out the fire checklist for us, please.
In fire emergencies, the crew follows a standard checklist to extinguish the fire.
The breaker popped as well, huh? We'll check the breaker panel as well.
The fire is burning through the plane's wiring, causing short circuits.
Move as far forward as you can.
But there's a more immediate problem. Passengers are having trouble breathing.
Duct isolation valve switches, open. Pack valve switches, all open. Recirculating fan switches, off.
The fire checklist instructs the pilot to land at the nearest airport, but the closest one is on the island of Mauritius, still more than 300 kilometers away. There's not a lot Captain Ace can do. He asks a member of his flight crew to help fight the cargo fire.
Bring me another bottle.
Captain Ace initiates an emergency descent. He calls the airport on the island of Mauritius, which is on good terms with South Africa. It's just before 4 in the morning when Mauritius Air Traffic Control receives the call.
Mauritius, Springbok 295.
Springbok 295, Mauritius. Good morning. Go ahead.
Good morning. We have a smoke problem and we're doing emergency descent to level 140.
Confirm you wish to descend to level 140.
Yeah, we've already commenced due to a smoke problem in the airplane.
Do you request a full emergency, please?
Affirmative. That's Charlie.
Captain Ace sounds calm, but he has to find a way of getting rid of the smoke on his plane. Whatever's burning in the cargo hold is producing thick, noxious smoke which is pouring into the cabin. It could be deadly to the passengers.
Your actual position, please. Say again?
Actual position.
Captain Ace is losing power to many of his instruments.
We've lost a lot of electrics. We haven't got anything on the aircraft now.
He's not sure where he is. The airport prepares for an emergency landing, while the crew of the Helderberg follows instructions from another checklist to get rid of the smoke.
Supplementary vent fan switch, off. Recirculating fan switches, on. Smoke condition.
Hold on, I'll check downstairs.
The crew gets more bad news from the cabin. The smoke is getting thicker.
It's worse.
We can't breathe down here.
With the plane approaching an altitude of 4,500 meters, the checklist advises the captain to execute an emergency maneuver that few pilots have ever performed.
We need to open the doors. Repeat, open the doors.
Opening the plane's doors in midair is the only hope for thinning a cloud of smoke that could kill the passengers before the struggling jet can land. As the cabin of South African Airways Flight 295 fills with smoke, there's only one way to save the passengers from the lethal fumes.
Out of flight level 150 for 140.
150 for 140. 150.
The captain begins his emergency descent to 4,500 meters so the doors can be opened. At 4,500 meters, passengers can breathe the outside air. At that altitude, the difference in pressure between the air inside and outside the cabin is enough to force the cabin air out quickly, but not dangerously. Now the captain must dramatically reduce his airspeed to 370 kilometers an hour, 200 knots. Any faster and the crew won't be able to open the doors.
This is Captain Oy speaking. We're opening 2 of the entry doors to clear smoke from the cabin. Do not panic. You'll be much more comfortable once we complete this procedure.
You just crack the door, and this generates a tremendous amount of airflow through the airplane.
Blazin' Springbok 295. We've opened the doors to see if we can... we should be okay.
Out there!
Close the bloody door. Joe, switch up quickly. Then close the hole on your side.
Smoke is now building in the cockpit, but there's no outside door to open.
Temperature is 22.22, and the QNH is 1018 hectopascals. 1018 over.
The air traffic controller now focuses on giving the captain the information he needs for an emergency landing.
Roger, 1018.
Affirmative. And both runways are available if you wish. And 295, I request pilot's intention.
We'd like to track in on 13.
Confirm runway 13.
Charlie, Charlie.
Affirmative, you're cleared direct to Foxtrot, Foxtrot. You report approaching 50.
Okay.
Captain Ace has one hope. He must make it to the island of Mauritius, 265 kilometers away. The Helderberg continues on its desperate journey.
295, play sense.
But at 4:08 in the morning, a call by the air traffic controller is not returned.
Springbok 295, play sense. Springbok 295, play sense.
With no response from Flight 295 for 36 minutes, Air Traffic Control Mauritius formally declares an emergency. An alert goes out to search and rescue crews. Several aircraft take off from Mauritius and search the dark waters for the missing plane, but find nothing. At the airport in Johannesburg, South African Airways officially declares Flight 295 delayed.
We were supposed to be going away on our annual holiday, so we were all very excited because from picking them up, my parents up from the airport, we were supposed to go off to 3-week holiday. I think that's maybe the extent of the differences of the emotions, is that you're so anxious and excited for them to come home, and then the absolute devastation of the news, getting the news, you know, that the aircraft has gone missing.
In the afternoon of the next day, a rescue plane spots the first signs of floating aircraft wreckage. Rennie van Zyl, the head of South Africa's Aviation Safety Board, is assigned to the Helderberg case.
A normal investigator will only handle a major accident about once in 20 years in his career. So this was quite a big wake-up and a challenge to us to start running with this investigation in that morning.
8 bodies are found in the water, all suffering from extreme trauma.
It was around about 2 o'clock that we, in fact, were advised that wreckage and an oil slick had been spotted. And it was then quite apparent that the airplane was lost.
The most astonishing thing is that my parents had actually, the night before they had flown, had sorted out their wills, had sorted out their insurances, had sorted out all of their documentation and paperwork before they flew, which was quite amazing. My father made very, very close family friends of ours, our guardians, our godparents, and we were to live with them.
South Africa quickly becomes obsessed with what caused the crash. In the early days, there's very little to examine, only small bits of the plane that are floating on the surface. Contained within that debris, Rennie van Zyl's team discovers 3 wristwatches. The watches give them a probable time of impact.
These wristwatches were in fact part of the baggage, and when examined we were able to find that the one had stopped and 2 others were still running, and the 2 running ones were the exact Taiwanese time, but the stopped one did give us the minute indication of what we could establish as the impact time of the airplane.
The impact time is only 3 minutes after the last communication with the plane. The Helderberg's demise was sudden and dramatic. In the press and in public opinion, it reinforces the idea that something sinister brought the plane down. In the years leading up to the crash, South African Airways offices around the world had been the target of protests.
The South African Airways airline at that particular time was a government body. It was owned by the government. It was the national carrier, but it was also very much perceived to be part of the South African government. So another aspect of this plane crash and another theory that was put around was that there could have been a bomb in the cargo, that in fact we were a target. South Africa, or this SAA plane, was a target of terrorists who had the worst interests of this country at heart.
Experts examine the small bits of wreckage they have, searching for the telltale signs of an explosion: impact cavities, surface pitting, or spatter cavities. Spatter cavities are caused by the white-hot fragments from a high-explosive device striking and melting the light alloys of the aircraft structure. But experts spot no sign of an explosion. And when air traffic control tapes are studied, Van Zyl hears that the crew appeared to be coping with the emergency.
Layson, Springbok 295, we've opened the doors to see if we can... we should be okay.
We've had rumors of atomic bombs, for example, in the airplane. That won't cause the airplane to burn. It will take out the airplane. We did not have that same experience here. This airplane flew for 22 minutes. It's out of the ordinary circumstances. This was not an explosion that took out the airplane.
With just small pieces of the plane to study, investigators are stumped. They don't know what caused the fire or what role it played in the destruction of the plane.
The obvious thing to do was to go and try and retrieve the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder, and as much wreckage as we can from the aircraft to establish what really had happened.
The problem is Van Zyl doesn't even know where to find the underwater wreckage. It could be far from the floating debris. No one is sure exactly where the plane crashed. He turns to the United States looking for help. An American salvage company is hired to find the wreckage and black boxes, but time is running out. The boxes have built-in locating devices called pingers, which run on batteries and will eventually run down.
A driving factor was that the pinger on the data and voice recorders was transmitting, and it only had a 30-day guaranteed shelf life. If we couldn't get out there in 30 days, the chances were that we wouldn't be able to detect it.
By the time the proper equipment can be assembled in the Indian Ocean, only 7 days remain before the batteries and the pingers will die out. Meanwhile, blood tests are performed on the human remains pulled from the debris field. All show traces of soot in their trachea. It's determined that at least 2 of the passengers died from smoke inhalation. Investigators face a disturbing realization. Even as the crew was struggling to land their plane, some of the passengers were already dead. While searching for the black boxes, investigators continue to examine the floating wreckage. Amongst the hundreds of recovered items, a partly melted graphite tennis racket offers a telltale clue about the fire. Graphite only burns at temperatures greater than 600 degrees Celsius. Investigators now know that the fire on the Helderberg was extremely hot. This discovery may explain why a fully charged extinguisher from the front of the plane is recovered with other floating wreckage. Investigators notice a melted piece of cargo netting on the outside of the extinguisher. They determine that the extinguisher is from the passenger cabin, suggesting that as the fire burned, a crew member grabbed the extinguisher and brought it to the cargo area.
A full fire extinguisher in a plane that was brought down by a fire shows that for whatever reason it wasn't discharged because the crew member couldn't access the area because of the heat, or the fact that there was melted metal on the fire extinguisher is further evidence to the intensity of the fire.
Before this accident, in the 20-year history of the 747 Combi, no one had ever died from fire or smoke.
When we heard about a fire in the Helderberg, this was the first time for a wide-body airplane. It It was news, and because it was so new, and the thought was that we really couldn't have anything like that.
What could have caused such an intense fire on the Helderberg? Was it a wiring problem on the plane, or had the cargo itself somehow started the blaze?
Initially, the investigation, of course, focused on what was the cargo. The fire obviously had originated in the Mayday cargo compartment, so the logical thing is to look what did the waybills indicate was carried in the airplane.
Investigators learned that there were 6 pallets of cargo on board Flight 295. Using master waybills, Van Zyle's team is able to determine that 47,000 kilograms of baggage and cargo was officially on board. Investigators discover that before takeoff, a Taiwanese customs official performed a random inspection of some of the cargo. He found nothing suspicious. More than ever, investigators need to find the rest of the plane and locate the Helderberg's black boxes. But 30 days after the crash, Van Zyle's team gets some very bad news. There's still no signal detected from the black boxes, and they're still not certain exactly where the majority of the wreckage is. So far, the search has cost $1.5 million, and the team has been unable to locate vital evidence. The Helderberg crash is quickly becoming a test of Van Zyle's abilities and his resolve. The investigation reaches a standstill. Van Zyl has failed to discover the cause of the fire or even find the plane's wreckage. If he keeps looking, it'll cost millions more. And the chances of success are getting increasingly remote.
This wasn't just an airplane, this was a Boeing 747. It was the largest airplane of its type. And this was a 747 of South Africa's national airlines. Hundreds of thousands of people who flew the 747 every day at that time were dependent on a satisfactory answer as to whether or not this aircraft was safe and whether or not there were any structural or design deficiencies in the airplane. So the stakes for us were quite large, and the stakes for Mr. Van Zyl as the head of the South African investigation were enormous.
It would have been very, very easy for the South African government to say, the water is too deep, it's too far from Mauritius, we cannot investigate this accident.
Well beneath the grey waves of the Indian Ocean, the wreckage of the Helderberg remains hidden. Now one man, René Van Zyl, must decide whether to spend the money needed to recover the plane's wreckage. But almost 2 months after the Helderberg slammed into the Indian Ocean, no one even knows the precise location of the main wreckage. Van Zyl decides he must try to recover what he can.
Without the wreckage, we'll never know the truth.
So they spent on one investigation what we spent in 6 months of conducting all of our investigations in the United States.
Before investigators can salvage the Helderberg, they must find it. The wreckage lies somewhere very deep underwater. 61 days after the crash of the Helderberg, Van Zyl receives some intriguing news from his team. Sophisticated sonar equipment has detected a large object 4,400 meters underwater on a flat plateau. It could be the Helderberg.
And they presented me with a piece of paper with a lot of black dots of various sizes on it, and they said, that's your wreckage. And my question to them was, how do I know it's the wreckage of the 747? Maybe this is a submarine from the Second World War or something. And the response was just, René, it is it, because we tell you it is the wreckage.
But no one's ever gone that deep to salvage anything, including the Titanic. Van Zyl has no choice. To find out whether the sonar images are in fact the wreckage, he must launch the most expensive part of the investigation, Operation Resolve. A remote-controlled sub called the Gemini will be sent to the ocean floor to videotape what's there. If it is the Helderberg, the Gemini will search for key items, including the black boxes. The problem is that the mini-sub must be attached to the mothership by a flexible fiber optic cable that's almost 7 kilometers long. No cable that long has ever been built.
We needed a 20,000-foot cable. There was no existing cable, so we had to go to a cable manufacturer and get a cable designed and built.
But before the fiber optic cable is assembled, Van Zyl launches a separate investigation into the firefighting capabilities of the Helderberg. He would discover that the very design of the combi may have doomed the flight. Investigators want to know whether the combi was properly designed to protect the passengers on South African Airways Flight 295 from fire.
The smoke should not have entered the combi's cabin.
The American team leader in the investigation, Barry Strauch, goes to Boeing's headquarters in Seattle to find out how the combi was tested for certification in fire prevention. Strauch's team learns that to comply with federal regulations, Boeing's fire tests were conducted by setting a bale of tobacco leaves on fire. When a technician enters the cargo area to fight the demonstration fire, no smoke enters the passenger cabin. The smoke remains localized. The fire is quickly extinguished.
Well, that was in the test conditions that Boeing used to get the airplane approved. But in the reality, as we saw in this accident, it didn't work that way because you didn't have a nice clean fire with fans blowing the smoke towards the ceiling. You had pallets, you had a fire that would have grown considerably before the smoke was generated, and you had plastic sheeting that would provide fuel to the fire, in addition to all the cardboard and packing materials within the pallets themselves.
The combi is designed to prevent smoke from entering the passenger cabin. The air there is kept at a slightly higher pressure than in the cargo area. When the door between the two is opened, the air should flow into the cargo area, keeping the passengers safe. Investigators then conduct their own test. They set a large pallet of tightly packed cargo on fire, mimicking conditions on the Helderberg. The blaze is more intense and the temperature is hotter. Investigators discover that this much hotter flame has a radical impact on the air in the cargo hold. When the cargo door is opened, the smoke now flows into the passenger cabin.
Boeing tests used tobacco leaves in batches of tobacco. In the fire in the Helderberg, it was a very, very different fire than the kind of smoke-generating fire that Boeing used in their tests. Heat would have been generated within the cargo compartment that would have created its own pressure and would have negated the pressure differential between the cargo compartment and the passenger compartment. Without the pressure differential, there would be nothing to restrain the smoke and keep it on the cargo side. And therefore, the smoke would have penetrated into the passenger side, smoke that contained, as we know, carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide.
Then investigators discover something potentially more lethal. As the passenger cabin filled with smoke, a checklist instructed the crew to turn on the cabin's recirculating fans. The intention of the checklist is to dissipate the smoke in the passenger cabin after the fire has been extinguished.
Recirculating fan switches on.
But in this case, turning the fans on may have been deadly. Fans draw air from above the cabin's ceiling and from the cargo compartment before recirculating it back to the passengers.
The carbon monoxide levels were extremely high and were fatally high. In fact, the one body, and we have to stress again, he was allocated the seat really below the recirc fan inlet area. That was the highest level. I think we're talking around about 66%. That is not a survivable level at all.
By following their checklist, the crew may have fed toxic gas into the passenger cabin.
And it might very well have been that most of your passengers were asphyxiated before impact.
No checklist for a 747 combi had ever foreseen the Helderberg's simultaneous problems, a cargo fire problem and a cabin smoke problem.
The smoke removal checklist is predicated on the assumption that the fire has been extinguished. In that event, descending to 14,000 feet and opening the cabin door would be the appropriate thing to do. It would get the smoke out of the airplane and enable people to breathe regular air. If the fire hasn't been extinguished, that would have the function of actually increasing the airflow to the fire and increasing the supply of oxygen to the fire. We think that's what happened in this case, that the fire had never been extinguished. And in fact, the crew's attempts to make the situation better may have in fact made the situation worse.
Investigators begin to realize that fighting a fire in the combi's cargo area is much more difficult than previously thought.
If there was a fire in one of these pallets, it was quite likely that by the time the crew was alerted to the fire, it would be too late.
Then the cabin instantly filled up with smoke.
But Van Zyl still doesn't know what caused such a fierce fire. How had the blaze started? And how had it brought the plane down? The answers are still deep under the ocean. It takes months to build the fiber optic cable that's long enough for the Gemini to reach the bottom of the sea and to modify the submarine for this mission.
We had to take the ROV, existing ROV that we had, which was designed for 6,000 feet, and we had to modify it so it would go to 20,000 feet.
Roy Truman's team had to give the sub thicker walls to withstand the enormous pressure it would encounter and modify its cameras for the extreme depth. On September the 23rd, 1988, the Gemini begins its record-breaking journey.
We were hesitant to say that everything would work because we didn't even have time to do sea trials on this, all of this new equipment.
The cable allows technicians at the surface to manipulate the Gemini at 4,400 meters. It also carries video signals from that remarkable depth. It's the first time that video images have been recorded from this deep in the Indian Ocean. Marine biologists are fascinated by the discovery of unique new species.
Some of the stuff that we saw on the seabed was pretty mind-blowing.
Then, 1 year to the day after it disappeared, the Helderberg is found. From a depth of 4,400 meters, the submarine sends back images that could only be the wreckage of South African Airways Flight 295.
There would be lots of luggage just strewn all over the seabed. Massive structures, the wings, tail, huge parts of the cabin split open, and you could see all of the ribs and the wiring, the hydraulic piping. I mean, it was incredible just to see everything that went into a machine spread over an area of about 5-6 square miles. It was incredible.
Van Zyl's expensive gamble is beginning to pay off. Descending to the Helderberg's wreckage is a triumph for him and his team. But just finding the debris isn't nearly enough. A year after the accident, Van Zyl is still hoping for the improbable, the recovery of the cockpit voice recorder.
One of the major aspects we aimed at in Operation Resolve was the recovery of the CVR. We really wanted to know whether the cabin crew reported to the captain that there was an explosion or what was happening at the back.
Hundreds of hours of videotape are recorded. It's exhausting work.
If you can imagine being on a football field with a flashlight that only illuminates a square foot of the football field, and you're looking for an earring one of the football players lost during the game in the dead of night. That's similar to what it's like when we're on the seabed.
Then, at 9 o'clock one morning, something catches the eye of one of the technicians.
Go back for a second. We might have passed.
At long last, the black box is discovered.
There, that's it. That's it right there. Michael, we found it. We found it.
That was a very fulfilling moment to know, fine, what we had aimed for, we have achieved, we're getting it.
It takes a full 5 hours for the Gemini to bring the black box up from the bottom of the sea. The South African media turns the discovery into front-page news. It's now 1989, and the apartheid government is still running the country with an iron fist. Van Zyl makes an unusual decision. He takes the sealed black box to Washington and opens it there.
Because otherwise I would have been accused of having covered up something or left something out or whatever. And we, the FAA and the NTSB guys, all listened to this tape at the same time for the first time.
Tension in the room is high. The cockpit voice recorder should be a tape of the last 30 minutes of the flight, as the crew fought the fire. But the tape turns out to be a major frustration. After a year on the bottom of the ocean, it's difficult to understand anything.
It was the worst time of my life, sitting in the playback room at the NTSB facilities, and you watch the time, and there is absolutely no indication of problems on the tape. And I'm watching the clock. At about 25 minutes, I was really getting very, very anxious.
For 28 minutes, the tape reveals nothing unusual. Then everything changes.
The next minute, of course, the alarm bell goes on the CVR, and we had about a minute's worth of relevant recording on the tape before the tape stopped.
Normally, the black box records the final moments of a flight, but not this time. Instead, investigators are able to listen to the start of the accident before the recording mysteriously stops. It's not what Van Zyl was hoping for, but it gives him crucial new insight into the fire.
Read out the fire checklist for us, please.
14 seconds after the fire alarm goes off, the plane's circuit breakers start to pop.
The breaker popped as well, huh? We'll check the breaker panel as well. Yeah.
Investigators estimate that up to 80 circuits were disabled. The wires to the cockpit voice recorder are destroyed only 81 seconds after the fire alarm first goes off. Van Zyl has not received the key evidence that he hoped for, but the fire is revealed as more violent than previously thought. The recording leaves many questions unanswered, but it does help Van Zyl to arrive at a personal opinion as to why the plane may have crashed.
A lot of things were happening in the cockpit, and we believe that he probably was faced to up to 80 circuit breakers popping in the cockpit at the time. May have made controlling of the aircraft extremely difficult. And the possibility then even of the airplane just gradually descending into the sea. Whether it was a controllable flight, I have my doubts.
I put myself in the cockpit on this thing, and I said, I would have been terrified. Heaviness, and just figuring out what do we do? Did they do the checklist correctly? We'll never know.
But investigators still don't know what triggered the Helderberg fire. The mystery can now only be solved by salvaging parts from the crashed plane.
We realized that what we had to do was just to continue recover as much wreckage as we could from the ocean floor.
Van Zyl's focus is on certain key pieces of the combi's cargo area. They're brought to a hangar and reassembled like a giant jigsaw puzzle. His plan is to reconstruct the section of the cargo area where the fire most likely started. Van Zyl discovers that the cargo area floor is untouched by fire.
So we know that the fire never burned lower than 1 meter off the cargo floor.
But the walls and ceiling at the front of the cargo area reveal severe fire damage. Van Zyl makes a dramatic discovery. The seat of the fire was on the front right pallet of the cargo.
So we were looking at a very localized fire on one pallet.
The front right pallet was mostly filled with computers, protected by polystyrene packaging. Investigators suspect that a fire within the pallet came in contact with the polystyrene packing material, producing gases which accumulated near the ceiling. When the gases became hot enough, they ignited into a flash fire that spread throughout the cargo hold.
Once smoke penetrated the polyethylene sheets, that fire would have been very, very hot.
But even if the packing material had helped spread the blaze, Van Zyl still didn't know why it started. After millions of dollars and more than a year and a half of work, he has to end his investigation.
I would have felt a lot better if we had been in a better position to give more factual information to the board to consider. But that was not to be. And we were not going to fabricate.
But interest in the wreck of the Helderberg doesn't die. Dark rumors circulate about a possible cause of the fire.
It's against this backdrop of a very repressive apartheid government. At that particular time, the first thought, I think, for many, many South Africans was what was on that plane. Was there something in that cargo hold that could have caused that terrible fire? Because planes don't just burst into flames mid-air and crash.
Then a South African government chemist makes a startling discovery, which leads to a controversial new theory. A microscopic iron particle on the nylon netting next to the pallet has a unique profile. The airflow patterns on the iron suggest that it traveled at a very high velocity while in a molten state. The discovery could mean that the fire on the Helderberg was not a flash fire triggered by packing materials.
This was a different kind of fire. This was a fire that had its own oxygen. If you can imagine something like a sparkler, which has fuel and its own oxygen, it was some kind of material similar to a sparkler that we feel was the cause of the fire.
A British fire and explosion analyst examines the exterior skin of the plane above the pallet and comes up with another piece of evidence to support the new theory. The skin on the outside of the plane reached temperatures as high as 300 degrees centigrade.
You must remember that it's very difficult to burn through an airplane skin in flight because the tremendous amount of cooling from the airflow on the outside of the skin.
Dr. David Klatzo is one of numerous experts who question what caused the fire.
It would have involved substances which normally would not have been carried aboard an aircraft, particularly a passenger aircraft. In other words, it could not have been a normal packing material, wood, cardboard, plastic fire. You don't carry the things of that nature which carry their own oxygen, which can produce an accelerated fire, for a number of reasons, one of which they are generally unstable. The second reason is that normal fire extinguishing methods will not put them out.
What could start such a fire? The only dangerous goods listed on the cargo manifest are computer batteries. Some believe the Helderberg must have been carrying cargo that wasn't listed. At the time, South Africa was under an international arms embargo. The country was also fighting a war with Angola.
South Africa didn't have capacity to do everything itself, and there were times when it had to buy from other countries. SAA was seen as a surrogate cargo carrier, that they could somehow, through its commercial airline use, also bring in substances for the South African government, undercover, under protection, no questions asked.
It was not that easy for them to fly a quasi-military airline into different countries and pick up military contraband, which you must remember we were laboring under an arms embargo at the time.
The media fuels the flames of suspicion that the government was using passenger jets to secretly import weapons. Armscor is the corporation responsible for supplying the South African forces with munitions.
At the time, there was a need to produce a better rocket system, a more efficient rocket system for dealing with the air menace in Angola. And the rocketry systems which are used for those purposes have as their propellant, a major component of the propellant is ammonium perchlorate. And that is what I believe was being carried aboard the Helderberg. But it is not the sort of compound you want on an aircraft when you are flying on that aircraft, because it is unstable, it is susceptible to self-ignition by any kind of vibration and violent movement.
The official investigation into the crash does not come to the conclusion that the Helderberg was carrying illegal arms. But the rumors won't go away. And more than 10 years after the crash, the dark theories force a very different South African government to take another look. The Helderberg accident revealed that the 747 Combi was vulnerable in the event of an onboard fire. South African Airways immediately stops using the 747 Combi. American officials take notice.
And the FAA went through and developed some new regulations, but for the weight and everything that was going to have to be added in there did not make it an economically feasible. And so essentially after the Helderberg accident, 747 Combis were not used anymore.
There are tributes and memorials to the 159 victims. But closure does not come easily for the families.
I need an answer for why I was orphaned at 14. And I feel that, as I say, I'm probably touching on hearsay, but there's a lot of evidence that does point to something not being right on that flight, and that the flight was carrying something illicit.
10 years after the Helderberg crash, the new South African government launches a commission to re-examine the accident.
The Truth Commission was tasked with basically uncovering the truth about apartheid atrocities, and one of the areas it was tasked to look at was the role of the SAA in sanctions busting during the 80s, and whether or not the Helderberg was a freak accident or not.
In 1998, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission makes a controversial conclusion. Namely, that nothing that was listed in the cargo manifest could have caused the fire.
And the Truth Commission recommended that there was something untoward about what had happened to the Helderberg.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission exposed the improbabilities of the government version as to what had happened.
If nothing in the cargo inventory caused the fire, what did? And how did it get on board?
The reality, unfortunately, is unless somebody today comes up and says, yes, I did this, or yes, we were responsible for this, and you can prove them not to be involved in a hoax, that will be possibly the only time in which we will really know what had happened and caused and was the source of ignition of the fire.
In its final report, the Commission suggests that the Attorney General's office continue to investigate the accident.
But surprisingly, that has never happened. The ANC-led government hasn't pursued that, and of course we have to ask ourselves why. And I think that the answer lies in what many people believe, is that it's just going to be too costly.
They don't want to open it for the simple reason that it will be financially disastrous for the airline.
Rennie van Zyl devoted years of his life to solving the mystery of the Helderberg. His inability to definitely prove the cause for the fire does not stop him from seeing the benefit of his investigation.
I believe that we as a team had done the best that we could under extreme challenging conditions and circumstances. What we had done had never been done before. It was pioneering work. The frustration is we could not establish the source of ignition, and we will probably never know.
I believe that those people are still out there that know exactly what happened to that aircraft. I know that their thought processes at the time were our country was at war and they were doing their duty for their country, But I just feel that they should have a heart for the families and bring out that information.
A crowded 747 has disappeared over the Atlantic.
Air India's not showing up.
Pieces are found scattered on the ocean's surface. But the vital clues are deeper than any air crash investigation has ever gone.
In this accident, we had nothing.
It was just mind-boggling.
An international recovery effort goes to the very bottom of the sea to rebuild the shattered plane. What they discover will send shockwaves around the world. Early morning, June the 23rd, 1985. A 747 flies across the Atlantic Ocean, 9.5 kilometers above the water. The jumbo jet is nicknamed Kanishka, after an Indian emperor. And Air India promises passengers it will be a palace in the sky.
Indian hospitality is something that the culture prides itself on, and you do experience that when you fly Air India. The colors are rich and warm inside. It's your gateway to India.
On its way from Canada, the plane is heading to London, England, before continuing on to New Delhi. It's been in the air for 4.5 hours. Captain Hansay Narendra is a veteran Air India pilot. Satwinder Binder is a captain too, who's serving as first officer on the flight. As the plane nears land, Binder talks with the flight's purser.
Yes, sir?
Inshah, do me a small favor. At the back of the plane, seat 54, a boy is sitting there. He just wanted to have a look in the cockpit.
Can I send him now?
After about 15 to 20 minutes.
There are 329 people on board, including passengers and crew. Many of them are flying to India to visit family or friends. Vishnu Pada is traveling to India with his 2 daughters. Their mother, Lata, is already waiting for them there.
We had decided that it would be the ideal year to take an extended vacation in India as a family.
6 minutes after 8 in the morning, co-pilot Binder makes radio contact with air traffic control in Ireland.
Shanwick, Air India 182, good morning.
Station calling Shannon. Go ahead again, please.
Thomas Lane and Michael Quinn are working at the Shannon Control Center.
Air India 182 is 51 north, 15 west at level 310. Estimate FIR at 0735.
Air India 182, Shannon, roger. Cleared for London, flight level 310.
Air India 182 is cleared to London, maintain 310.
You want to come up front now?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go.
It's a light morning at Shannon Control. They're dealing with just 3 planes. But something peculiar has happened.
The signals are all jumbled up.
The signals on radar merged so that it was totally impossible to read the call signs and flight levels of any of the 3 aircraft.
The Air India 747 is flying at 31,000 feet. A TWA jet is several thousand feet above it, and a CP flight is 2,000 feet higher. All are traveling east. Because the planes are stacked on top of each other, the signals have merged on the controller's 2-dimensional screen.
Tom moved the tracker ball on radar and separated the signals.
Two of the planes reappear on the radar, but the Air India flight has vanished.
Air India is not showing up.
Hold on a minute. Air India 182, do you read?
Air India 182, this is Shannon, do you read? Over.
It's 8:14 in the morning.
I had a gut feeling. To this day, I don't know why I picked up the phone.
Yes, it's Michael Quinn at Shannon. We have a plane off radar.
Normally, a distress call to search and rescue isn't made until a plane has been out of contact for more than 20 minutes. The Air India flight has been missing less than 60 seconds. Several ships in the area begin searching for signs of the plane. Its last known position is some 290 kilometers southwest of Cork. Just 2 hours after the plane disappears, a Canadian-owned cargo ship in the area confirms the worst. The first pieces of wreckage are discovered. Uninflated life rafts are spotted bobbing in the cold Atlantic. Then bodies are seen. It's quickly clear that no one has survived. In India, Lata Pada is waiting for her husband and 2 children to arrive when she hears the news from her brother.
He sat me down and told me that, something terrible had happened. I was just in total shock, and, part of me was trying to digest the information, and part of me was trying to imagine if indeed the worst had happened, how I was going to continue my life without them.
Dozens of bodies arrive in Cork. Many more will follow. Now investigators are faced with the enormous task of finding out how they died and what had caused the crash of Air India Flight 182. "130,000 people live in the city of Cork. Tucked into the southern coast of Ireland, it's long been a vital seaport. On June the 23rd, 1985, a gruesome cargo begins arriving at the city's docks. Just hours after Air India Flight 182 crashes into the sea, bodies and wreckage are brought in by boat. Dr. Cumin Doyle is a pathologist at the Cork Regional Hospital.
The first bodies arrived at 4:45 p.m. on that Sunday afternoon, and at 12 midnight we had 130 bodies.
Doyle and his team will examine the bodies to see if they can find any signs of what caused the crash.
It's an enormous undertaking for everybody involved, the hospital personnel, the police, the Navy, the Army, and pathologists like ourselves, but we just had to get on and do the job.
there are so many autopsies to perform that Doyle moves the work into the building's gym.
We had 3 police people working on each body, photographer, a ballistics expert, and a forensic odontologist. That is a person who examines the teeth, the face, for identification purposes.
In just 4 days, autopsies are performed on 132 victims.
All parts of the body were examined externally in detail, and every detail was noted down. We were looking, of course, for the causes of the fatalities.
Doyle makes a telling discovery. Almost all the victims died in the air.
Only 2 of the bodies showed signs of drowning, which indicated that the others were not breathing when they hit the water.
There's something else that's common to many of the victims. A large number have had their clothes torn off.
Now that was important because if they had no clothes or little clothes, it indicated that they had fallen from 31,000 feet or so where this accident occurred.
Some of the bodies also have signs of so-called flail injuries. These are breaks specific to bones in the hips, shoulders, and other joints. H.S. Kohler is the lead investigator into the Air India disaster. The flail injuries tell him the passengers weren't in the plane when it hit the ocean.
They are caused by tumbling, violent motion of the body in air. And that is the pattern of the injuries when a passenger is thrown out of the aircraft at a high altitude.
The autopsies show that somehow the plane had been ripped apart high above the water. Passengers were thrown into the sky long before the plane crashed.
Based on the injuries, we could only say that the plane had broken up at 31,000 feet. We couldn't say what the cause of the breakup was.
The biggest challenge in this accident was that we had no physical evidence available to us in this accident in terms of wreckage, in terms of passengers, crew, or in terms of eyewitnesses. In this accident, we had nothing.
The most important job of the investigators is to try to find the plane's black boxes. The 2 devices record cockpit conversation and other technical information about the flight of the plane. The recorders have radio beacons which send out a signal at a designated frequency. But it's still a huge task. The boxes are more than 6,500 feet below the surface, and the radio signals last just 30 days. Salim Jiwa is a journalist who has investigated the Air India disaster.
The search for the black boxes was urgent, and 3 countries participated in it: England, Ireland, and India.
But even with such a massive response, early efforts are frustrated.
42 kilohertz. It's too high. It can't be them.
Investigators are picking up radio signals, but they're at the wrong frequency. As the search continues, H.S. Kohler and his team study the maintenance history of the plane. They want to know if an undetected flaw had caused the jet to come apart in flight. They uncover a potentially important piece of information. The Air India jet was flying with 5 engines. A 747 normally has 4 engines, but it can carry more. The plane was designed so that it could transport a malfunctioning engine beneath its wings. Ground crews can mount the engine to a bracket on the plane. It's exactly what happened to the Air India jet.
There was an extra engine that a previous flight had left behind that was mounted on the wing of the aircraft.
The extra engine creates substantial drag on the left side of the plane. If the pilots don't properly compensate, the plane will start turning in that direction.
And this hypothesis continued that there is a possibility that this fifth engine might have caused the breakup of the wing.
In fact, investigators discover that before the plane took off for London, the flight engineer noticed problems with the way the engine was attached.
There was a small problem in the fifth engine. I've asked them to fix it up.
All right.
Investigators also learned that some internal parts of the extra engine were taken out and stored in Flight 182's cargo bay. They are so enormous that pieces of the cargo door were removed to make the job easier.
Some of the other parts of the engine went into the rear of the aircraft. Aircraft such as the 747 can handle this quite easily. It's routinely done.
But if the cargo door wasn't reassembled properly, it could have led to an explosive decompression. In 1974, a cargo door blew off a Turkish Airlines flight shortly after it took off from Paris. The sudden decompression crippled the plane. It crashed moments later, killing everyone on board. Kohler must consider two theories. Either problems with the door or with the extra engine itself brought down the plane. If either one had taken place, there should be evidence on the plane's black boxes. Finding the recorders has become increasingly important. Almost 2 weeks after the search begins, investigators get news that helps them pinpoint the location of the black boxes.
The signal will be higher. So this 42 kilohertz could be it. Tell the boats to look again.
The piece of the black box which broadcasts the locator signal is made of ceramic. If it's damaged, the frequency of the signal can change. It means the strange frequency ships detected earlier could be the right one. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder are finally located. But they're so deep, it's difficult to bring them up.
The aircraft was at 6,000 feet below the sea, and it was the depth that was sort of defeating.
A deep-sea submersible is brought in. But even with this specialized vehicle and with the location of the black boxes known, it takes 4 attempts to bring the recorders to the surface.
Estimate FIR at 0735.
Air India 182, Shannon, Roger. Cleared for London.
Lead investigator Kohler now has what he hopes are 2 vital pieces of the puzzle.
If there's any problem in the aircraft, the crew will be talking about the problem. They will not be silent about the problem.
But when he listens to the cockpit voice recorder, Kohler hears nothing unusual. After the last contact with air traffic control in Shannon, the voice recorder picks up the crew talking about customs seals.
To seal the bar before the
It's
arrival.
paperwork that has to be completed before landing.
Have not been used. And they want about 30 custom seals.
Customs?
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
The conversation ends in mid-sentence.
That was it, and then everything was, of course, silent.
The cockpit voice recorder indicated that there was no abnormality in the cockpit, no emergency. Every conversation was normal.
The plane's flight data recorder tells a similar story. Kohler pours through details about Air India's speed, altitude, and dozens of other pieces of information. The extra engine did cause the plane to bank slightly, and the jet's rudder was turned 11 degrees to the right. But this was exactly what the crew needed to do to offset the drag created by the fifth engine.
We found that all parameters of the aircraft altitude, aircraft heading, aircraft bank attitude, roll attitude, autopilot engage, everything was working normally till the last point.
After analyzing both black boxes, Kohler can't find any evidence that the plane was in trouble before it suddenly disappeared from radar. But the very lack of evidence does suggest something. Both recorders get their power from the plane's engines. Both stopped at exactly 14 minutes and 1 second after 8 in the morning. Since the recorders stopped working at the same time, the problem on the plane had to be catastrophic enough to sever the jet's electronic system before the crew could react.
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
Investigators are becoming convinced that there are only two possible explanations for the crash: a devastating decompression or a bomb. They study the wreckage that's been found floating on the surface of the ocean, but it's just a small percentage of the entire plane. And none of it is helpful to investigators. It offers no clues to explain why the plane crashed.
We knew there was no fire. We knew the aircraft was performing well. Everything was normal. There was no cockpit emergency, no warning. We got elimination of all the things, but we did not got the answer as what happened. We had to go to the cause of the accident. We had to go to the wreckage, which was lying at the bottom of the sea.
But what parts of the plane should investigators focus on? The black boxes were equipped with radio transmitters which made them easier to find. But the debris field is deep underwater and enormous, some 16 kilometers long and 6 kilometers across. How do investigators identify the one clue that will help them unlock the mystery? Roy Truman is an underwater salvage expert. He's brought in to do something that's never been done before: retrieve the ruined pieces of a jumbo jet from the bottom of the ocean. In hundreds of thousands of pieces, he needs to find the ones that will explain why the plane crashed.
Up until that time, we had only been used with recovering small aircraft. Here we're talking about a 747, which was huge, and we had no idea of the size of the pieces and what we were going to find.
Investigators know they can't bring the entire wreck to the surface. It's so deep it takes hours to recover a single piece. The submersible takes underwater video and still photos. Investigators use those to decide which pieces to bring to the surface.
It was a narrow corridor, and at each end of the corridor, it was very light wreckage. All of the heavy stuff, engines, main aircraft structure was in the middle of the wreckage field.
Like searching for a needle in an underwater haystack, investigators hope to discover the cause of the crash in a tangle of ruined metal. But autumn is coming. Soon the weather will turn bad, and they'll have to abandon their search. The key to unlocking the disaster still lies somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. Investigators from India are scouring the ocean floor, trying to find out why Air India Flight 182 fell from the sky. As the work continues in Ireland, there's growing suspicion in Canada that the Air India crash was no accident. As police and investigators sift through the list of passengers on the plane, they find something peculiar. Many of the passengers who were on Air India Flight 182 began their day in Vancouver. They were using another plane to connect to Flight 182. One of the passengers who bought a ticket for that plane never got on.
Well, the passenger, we have never identified him per se, but the ticket identified him as M. Singh. It simply had an initial, but no full name. We believe that name to be was fictitious, and that the person never intended to travel.
While he never boarded the plane, M. Singh did check in.
Next, please. On your way to Toronto?
And I want my bag checked through to Delhi.
Sir, I can't do that. Your reservation is only confirmed to Toronto.
Oh, I am confirmed. This is my ticket.
Jeannie Adams is a ticket agent working for
You are on
Canadian
standby
Pacific.
to Delhi. I can't. Mr. Singh, you are on standby to Delhi. I can't.
But then I have to pick up my bag.
I can't check your bags through to India if you are not confirmed.
But I am indeed confirmed. Wait, I'll get my brother. He'll tell you.
There are as many as 30 people waiting to check
Can't do
in.
that, sir. Your reservation is only confirmed to
Adams
Toronto.
doesn't have time to wait for the man's brother.
Oh, okay. I'll check it through. But you have to check with Air India when you get to Toronto. Your seat is 10D.
Even though Singh doesn't have a ticket taking him to India, his bag is checked straight through. His luggage is loaded, but no one notices that Singh never boards the plane that leaves Vancouver.
She broke the rules as they were. She should not have allowed that to go through for New Delhi Interline. But she was so bullied and so browbeaten by Mr. Singh in front of everybody else that I think to her eternal sadness and heartbreak, she gave in.
Singh's maroon bag didn't raise any concerns when it was loaded in Vancouver. Since the Air India flight was international, when the bag arrived in Toronto, it faced a more strict series of inspections.
This is what it will sound like.
John D'Souza is a security officer for Air India. The day of the flight, he demonstrated a portable explosives detector for baggage handlers in Toronto. Chemicals in a match triggered the device, as would chemicals used in some explosives.
Okay.
The portable device was put to use because the X-ray machine, which normally scans every piece of luggage, had broken down.
The technology, especially the X-ray technology, were very weak, very in their infancy at that time, and it didn't work reliably. And in the case of the Air India episode, the technology went quite badly wrong, which was one of the tragedies of this situation.
As security workers used the portable explosives wand on the bags, everything seemed normal, until they got to the maroon bag. The bag did trigger the device, but the sound it made was very different from the one workers heard during the demonstration. The bag was passed and allowed on board the plane, eventually flying towards England. Over the Atlantic Ocean, carrying M. Singh's bag, an explosion rips through Tokyo's Narita Airport. 2 baggage handlers are killed, 4 people are injured. A bomb has been hidden inside another piece of luggage that came from Vancouver. Luggage that was bound for another Air India jet.
And it was headed for the cargo hold. When it exploded on the ground, once it was put on, the bag was probably just thumped a little bit, and it exploded as the 2 Japanese baggage handlers were putting it on a conveyor belt.
Just as on Flight 182, one of the bags being moved in Tokyo was checked in by a passenger who never boarded the flight.
There was no X-ray machines in use at Vancouver Airport. There was nothing to stop that bag from flying to Tokyo.
There's a disturbing connection between the Tokyo bombing and the Air India flight. The tickets for the men who checked both bags were bought on the same day by the same customer. The single crash of Air India Flight 182 has suddenly become part of a much larger story. With the apparent connection between the two incidents, investigators in Ireland are extremely interested in what police find in Tokyo. Soon after the bombing, forensic experts descend on Japan's Narita airport. There are traces of evidence everywhere.
The Narita bombing was within a confined space. So unlike the Air India Flight 182 situation where we had debris scattered over 9 miles under the ocean and pretty hard to retrieve, we had, in a sense, the good fortune of a contained area where an explosive device went off.
Pieces of metal and circuit boards are embedded in the walls. Explosive residue clings to parts of the container that housed the bomb.
Amazingly, Japanese forensic experts were able to pick out tiny parts and fragments, and all the analysis finally led Japanese police to identify the vehicle that was used to carry the bomb.
Experts even find serial numbers on pieces of the wreckage. Clues that show the bomb was hidden inside a specific stereo tuner made by Sanyo. All 2,000 tuners that were ever made were shipped to a warehouse near Vancouver, British Columbia. From there, they were sent to stores across the region. One of those tuners carried the bomb that exploded at Narita. Police have a difficult task trying to trace the sale of 2,000 tuners. They could have been sold to anyone. Most of the stores that had received the tuner had been sold out for years. But police get a break when they ask about the tuner at a store in Duncan, a tiny town on Vancouver Island. The last unit had been sold just a few weeks ago.
They were able to figure out who bought the stereo tuner which contained the bomb.
Police obtained the same sort of tuner that was used to house the bomb on Air India. They conduct tests to see how big the bomb would have to be to create the sort of damage that was found in Tokyo.
There was a progressive experimentation using dynamite to find out the extent of damage particular strands of dynamite would cause.
They match the size of the tuner fragments made after each explosion with the fragments that were found at Narita. They discover that just a few sticks of dynamite were likely used in the Tokyo bomb. But could just 4 sticks of dynamite really bring down a jet? Once they discover just how powerful the Narita bomb was, police place it into a fully loaded luggage container. The devastation is enormous.
Any decompression caused by an event, or an explosive device in the luggage hold, would be sufficient to cause catastrophic results for that aircraft. You don't need much. 4 sticks of dynamite can do the job.
The cramped quarters of a cargo hold amplify the power of a bomb. Tests conducted at Penn State University show that the shock waves created from a bomb blast don't travel in just one direction, but reverberate inside a luggage container, building on each other, vastly increasing the initial force of the explosion. If a bomb had indeed exploded in the cargo hold of Air India, it would have caused enormous amounts of destruction. It's the sort of damage that should have left its mark on the remains of Flight 182. Investigators have a growing suspicion that this plane was brought down by a bomb. But they still have no proof.
So the investigators were not only looking for something that was broken that might have caused the failure, but they were looking for signs of what caused the explosion, such as burning or solvent stains or possibly shrapnel in seats. It meant a lot tighter scrutiny of every piece of wreckage.
We kept on analyzing each photograph. Is it giving any indication of an explosion? Is it giving any impact damage?
Knowing his time is running out, Kohler selects a few key pieces of the plane to bring to the surface. Bad weather forces him to leave the rest behind. Kohler hopes the bits he does have can prove there was a bomb on board. Each piece that's brought up is carefully mapped to its original position on the jet. One of the most promising sections brought up from the bottom is the floor of the front cargo bay.
When we recovered that item, we found that it had holes which are of a very special nature. Penetration from inside to outside at a very high speed. Curling of the edges of that one. And that was indicative of that perhaps this is the place where the explosion had occurred.
As many as 20 holes are found. In each, the metal is bent outward, like the petals of a flower. These are classic signs of something being blown out from the cargo bay. On the side wall of the cargo bay, investigators find more clues. Additional holes are discovered, like the ones on the floor. These also appear to have been blown out from the cargo hold. A closer study of the ceiling of the cargo bay also indicates that the ribs connecting it to the fuselage were broken by being forced up. Investigators are convinced that the wreckage shows that a bomb had exploded in the forward cargo hold. If the bomb had gone off in the front of the plane, it would explain why the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder cut off so quickly. Like other 747s, the electronics bay on the Air India flight is located below the cockpit. Many of the important electrical systems on the plane run through here. The forward luggage compartment is right beside it.
And so when the bomb went off, the explosion would have taken out the computers completely, and there would have been absolutely dead silence, and that's precisely what happened.
Investigators are convinced that Air India Flight 182 has been destroyed by a bomb. This was no accident. The crash of the passenger jet was a crime.
Nobody thought that such an evil plot of blowing two aircraft simultaneously would occur from Vancouver.
Exhaustive detective work creates a clear picture of what likely happened on board the Air India jet. In Toronto, M. Singh's bag is taken off the Vancouver flight and moved onto the Air India jet. It's put into a luggage container that's eventually placed at the front of the jet, right behind the plane's electronics bay. As the plane sailed over the Atlantic Ocean, the crew had no warning that a bomb was ticking down to disaster.
They want about 30 custom seals.
Customs?
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
When the force of the blast hit the floor of the jet, it pushed it violently upwards. The thin fuselage would have been blown apart. the air pressure inside the plane would have rushed out, tearing passengers from the cabin and fatally crippling the jet.
The debris scattered over 9 miles is an indication of how rapidly and how fearsome this whole decompression was. But in this instance, the aircraft completely didn't stand a chance of flight. There was no way of continuing flight in this case.
As the jet fell towards the sea, the forces put on the fuselage tore it apart.
It would have a tail torn off and the wings would start breaking. And there's no way of sustaining flight after that. It goes into gyrations. Once it goes into gyrations, there was just massive structural failure.
After months of painstaking work, investigators believe they have unraveled the cause of the Air India crash. They've proven a bomb brought the plane down. It's now up to police to find the bombers. But with so many deaths and so many more possible if the Narita bomb had exploded in midair, there's immediate interest in making passenger jets safer.
This was one of the biggest disasters in the Indian aviation history. And it could have been avoided if the procedures were in place.
As the hunt for the killers continues, extraordinary steps are taken to tighten security and to see if jets can be made to withstand the force of a bomb. It's May 1997. More than 10 years after a terrorist bomb destroyed Air India Flight 182. An out-of-service 747 is about to take part in a remarkable test. 2 bombs are placed in the front cargo bay. 2 more are put in the back.
Well, the Burning-Thorpe test was actually intended to prove 5 years worth of research, that we can protect an airplane using hardened luggage containers or hardened liners in the cargo hold.
The plane is also pressurized to simulate the conditions a jet would encounter at cruising altitude.
Pressurization is the key to that kind of experiment. The added energy that you have from the pressurization inside the airplane adds to the damage. You can think of it as a balloon. If you take a pin and you put it in a balloon that's uninflated, you get just a simple hole the size of the pin. However, if you blow that balloon up and you hit it with a pin, it pops catastrophically.
When the bombs are detonated, the result is devastating.
The force of the blast plus the pressure inside the jet just tore the plane apart. And that's the closest we can come to seeing what would have happened to a jet in flight.
The destructive power of bombs on jets is well known. But what the tests at Bruntingthorpe showed was that relatively simple measures can substantially minimize the damage caused by an explosion. One of the bombs in the rear cargo hold was placed in a normal luggage container. But the bombs in the front cargo hold were different. One was placed in a specialized container strengthened with a material similar to that found in bulletproof vests. The other was put in a normal container, but placed beside walls that had been reinforced with a blast-absorbing liner. When the bombs explode, the front of the plane is virtually untouched.
We had no breach of the airplane skin with the liner or with the hardened luggage containers. But towards the rear of the airplane or the tail, where we didn't have any of the hardened materials, it was a catastrophic failure for the airplane.
The standard luggage container did nothing to minimize the blast. Both the protective lining in the front cargo bay and the hardened luggage container were able to absorb the force of the explosion.
It's only speculation, but would steps like these have saved Air India? Very likely. Would they make the industry safer today? Absolutely.
Despite the dramatic results of the tests in Britain, hardened luggage containers are not used by world's airlines. While effective at stopping bombs, they're extremely expensive.
The hardened containers are not in use now because it's just not economically feasible. The containers cost the tens of thousands of dollars just to purchase, and they're very fragile. They're composite materials, so if you run into the side of them with a forklift, they're pretty much useless from that point forward.
There have been significant improvements made to the way that passenger luggage is screened at most international airports. More sophisticated color X-ray systems using multiple scanning beams are now used.
But I am indeed confirmed. Wait, I'll get my brother. He'll tell you.
Oh, okay. I'll check it through. But you have to check with Air India when you get to Toronto.
And there are stricter regulations about luggage getting sent forward on connecting flights.
In the case of Air India, the most important thing of all was passenger baggage reconciliation. This is the key to detecting an explosive device or a terrorist. No plane leaves with baggage unattached to a specific passenger inside that plane. And that must be so.
Seat is 10B.
I think one of the most difficult piece of news for the families to accept was the many ways in which this tragedy could have been prevented. I mean, it was absolutely unforgivable that a bag could be interlined to another destination without a passenger accompanying it.
The quality of training that security guards at airports get also came under scrutiny during the years after the Air India crash. It's still an area of concern for some security experts.
There's a real failure to train security personnel. And that failure is because you cannot pay rent-a-cops subsistent wages to look after your security when you get on board an aircraft.
In the Air India case, police eventually traced the bombing to Sikh extremists living in Canada. They're fighting to have an independent Sikh homeland created in India. The man who confessed to assembling the bomb is sent to prison. The man suspected of masterminding the plot is killed several years later while under arrest in India. Both men had deep ties to Canada's West Coast Sikh community. It's a connection that still bothers Lata Pada.
It was a deliberate act of terrorism, and hurts even more that they were executed by Canadians on Canadian soil against Canadians.
More than 20 years after the destruction of the Air India flight, the shock of the day is still fresh. And many questions remain unanswered.
We still don't know who the two people were who checked in the bags. Apart from the basics of who made the bomb, we don't know much about who else assisted them. We don't know who picked up those tickets. There's a vow of silence that has hindered the investigation.
This inquiry will be launched immediately.
In 2006, the Canadian government launched an inquiry into the Air India bombing, another investigation of what happened and why. The shocking death of so many is a continuing source of anger and disbelief. No matter what the inquiry finds, the sobering facts are the same. 329 people killed in an instant. There are memorials now in Ireland and Canada, mourning the victims of the Air India crash. Marking the day a terrorist bomb ripped through the lives of so many.
It's just so tragic about all our lives that we lead. Every day is an ordinary day in our lives, but some days, unexpectedly, something completely, totally unexpected shatters your life, and that was one of those moments.